Look, there is a very specific, almost intoxicating kind of silence that you only ever truly experience when you finally walk away from the relentless, soul-crushing grind of the corporate tech world, retiring with the kind of golden parachute that most people only read about in financial magazines, only to realize that the absolute hardest thing for a man accustomed to controlling massive streams of chaotic data to do is to simply sit still and do nothing. Most of the guys I used to share miserable, fluorescent-lit boardrooms with ended up buying absurdly expensive sailboats they didn't know how to rig, or took up competitive golf just to have an excuse to yell at the grass. But I was never a man for the greens or the open ocean, because my sanctuary, my undeniable passion, hummed with the raw, unbridled power of meticulously assembled silicon, pulling a constant 12 kilowatts of pure energy, demanding a heavily modified liquid cooling loop that rivaled industrial mainframes, and quietly serving as the absolute, unseen lifeline preventing the sprawling, perpetually gridlocked intersections of Washington Street and Ogden Avenue in Naperville, Illinois from devolving into a twisted, horn-blaring scene straight out of a post-apocalyptic wasteland every single afternoon. My name is Marcus Vance, a retired systems architect who spent a lifetime untangling the buggy, digital nightmares of Fortune 500 companies, and my garage was no longer a place for parking cars, but rather a glowing, pristine cathedral of server racks, stacked with top-tier motherboards, enterprise-class GPUs, and miles of perfectly managed Ethernet cables. A monolithic brain I built just to feel the satisfying rush of optimizing a broken world. To the outside observer, my neighborhood, the painfully manicured Oakmont Estates, was the quintessential American suburban dream. A sprawling purgatory of identical beige facades, flawlessly edged lawns, and mailboxes that stood like terrified little soldiers afraid to lean even a fraction of an inch out of plumb, all existing under the suffocating, militant rule of a homeowners association that treated aesthetic conformity not just as a preference, but as a violent, unquestionable religion. And the high priestess of this terrifying suburban cult, the woman who prowled the sidewalks with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield and a laminated, color-coded binder of bylaws that she wielded like a weapon of mass destruction, was Evelyn Sterling, the president of the Oakmont Estates Property Owners Association, OEPOA. From the sanctuary of my garage, enveloped in the soothing, low-frequency hum of my cooling fans and illuminated by the cool, cinematic blue light bleeding off a curved array of 12 massive monitors, Evelyn wasn't really a human being to me anymore. She was just a rogue data point, a constantly recurring error code in my otherwise flawlessly optimized existence. A figure I would watch pacing across my high-definition security feeds as she aggressively measured the height of my neighbors' hedges or scowled at the subtly unapproved tint of their new exterior paint. My world was built on logic, on the beautiful, undeniable truth of cause and effect, where every single variable within my property lines was accounted for, monitored, and automated, from the subterranean moisture sensors dictating the exact millimeter of water my lawn received, to the predictive algorithms running the unofficial, highly classified traffic control override I had engineered for the city of Naperville, quietly bypassing their ancient, dial-up era grid after a few anonymous donations to the right civil engineering departments gave me backdoor access to the fiber lines beneath the asphalt. I was the ghost in the machine, a benevolent digital god watching an 18-wheeler approach a stale yellow light on my center monitor, seamlessly extending the green by exactly 3.4 seconds to allow the massive rig to clear the intersection, preventing a 2-mile backup and keeping the arteries of the city flowing, finding a deep, almost spiritual peace in providing this invisible order to a chaotic world. But peace, I was quickly learning, is the one thing a tyrant absolutely cannot stand, and my house, with its faint, ever-present baseline hum of industrial ventilation and a heavily reinforced roof bristling with discreetly mounted, high-gain telemetry antennas, was a glaring, vibrating middle finger to Evelyn's beige, static empire. The opening volley of what would soon become a legendary, scorched-earth neighborhood war didn't start with a scream or a shattered window, but with the quiet, terrifying ping of a mandatory community email landing in my inbox, a passive-aggressive manifesto detailing the illicit vibrancy of a neighbor's newly planted flowerbed, followed by a bold, heavily underlined decree stating that any unusual humming or excessive electrical draw was now officially classified as a violation of utility decorum, a thinly veiled, direct threat aimed squarely at the beating heart of my servers. I just smiled, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and watching the digital traffic flow smoothly on my screens, feeling a dark, competitive thrill spark in my chest, because she had absolutely no idea the kind of fire she was playing with, or the sheer, devastating volume of electrons I had at my disposal. The real escalation, the true crossing of the Rubicon, happened on a sweltering Tuesday morning when Hank, a contractor whose face looked like a topographic map of the Grand Canyon, and who spoke mostly in tobacco-stained grunts, pulled his battered Chevy Silverado onto my driveway to break ground on a massive, subterranean geothermal cooling loop I was installing to properly chill my server farm, a project that would actually take me mostly off the municipal power grid, only to be ambushed by a mail carrier handing me a certified, aggressively stamped envelope from the OEPOA. It was an official cease and desist order, a heavily redacted, pseudo-legal nightmare accusing me of operating an unauthorized, heavy industry commercial enterprise within a residential zone, threatening me with catastrophic, compounding daily fines of $500, and demanding that all excavation stop immediately, accompanied by blurry, covertly taken photos of Hank's truck shot from the cowardly vantage point of Evelyn's second-story bedroom window. Hank spat a stream of brown liquid into the pristine gutter, looking at the letter with deep disgust, asking if I wanted him to pack up his excavator and walk away. But an ordinary man backs down from a threat, while an engineer, a man who has spent his life finding the most ruthlessly efficient way to break a system, sees an unoptimized challenge. And I looked back at Hank with a cold, dead-eyed grin, telling him to fire up the heavy machinery, because I was about to bury this woman in a mountain of bureaucratic paperwork so pristine, so legally bulletproof, that it would make her physically ill. I abandoned the traffic grid for the day, plunging into a hyper-focused state of sheer, vindictive documentation, compiling a 32-page, spiral-bound dossier that systematically destroyed every single one of her claims, attaching high-resolution scans of signed, notarized permits from the Naperville Department of Buildings, letters of environmental compliance proving my geothermal rig was classified as a green energy residential upgrade, and a brutally polite legal citation regarding state privacy laws and the covert photography of private citizens, CCing every single miserable member of her board just to ensure the humiliation was public, permanent, and absolutely inescapable. I dropped the heavy package into the mail slot, feeling the satisfying weight of the trap springing shut, looking up to see Evelyn glaring at me from behind her sheer curtains, completely unaware that she hadn't just picked a fight with a homeowner. She had declared war on a man who had built a digital fortress, and the siege was only just beginning. The immediate fallout of my 32-page masterclass in bureaucratic destruction was nothing short of cinematic, playing out on my ultra-wide security monitors the very next morning like a perfectly framed, high-drama YouTube documentary about the collapse of a tiny, localized dictatorship, as three panicked members of the OEPOA board sprinted across the manicured lawns toward Evelyn's house, waving their arms in desperate, terrified arcs, realizing that they had just threatened to sue a man who possessed more ironclad municipal permits than a commercial real estate developer. But a cornered tyrant doesn't apologize, a cornered tyrant doubles down, and having lost the tactical high ground of actual, written law, Evelyn immediately pivoted to the oldest, dirtiest trick in the history of human conflict, launching a desperate, grassroots smear campaign built entirely on fear, paranoia, and outright, unabashed lies. I cranked the gain on the hidden parabolic microphone nestled discreetly inside a fake landscaping rock near my property line, sitting in the cool darkness of my server room, listening with a mix of disgust and sheer awe as she marched up and down the street in her pressed slacks, knocking on doors and whispering toxic, conspiratorial nonsense to anyone who would listen, telling my next-door neighbor, Julian, a brilliant, heavily tattooed cloud security engineer who completely understood and respected my setup, that my house was a ticking, hyper-industrial firebomb, emitting radioactive frequencies that were slowing down her morning toaster and threatening to burn the entire subdivision to the ground. Julian, bless his cynical, tech-literate heart, practically laughed in her face, flatly reminding her that my custom liquid cooling pumps made less noise than her own rattling central air unit, before slamming his heavy oak door shut and leaving her standing on his porch, vibrating with an unholy mix of rejection and raw, unadulterated fury. She found her audience, however, in Arthur, a cripplingly anxious, easily manipulated man 3 houses down who lived in perpetual terror of receiving a lawn height citation, gasping and clutching his chest as Evelyn pointed a dramatic, trembling finger toward the massive, heavily insulated, dedicated ComEd Illinois power conduit feeding into my garage, convincing him that it was a throbbing, malevolent umbilical cord sucking the very lifeblood out of the neighborhood grid, whipping the terrified man into such a frenzy that they immediately called for an emergency, mandatory town hall tribunal to publicly excommunicate me from the subdivision. I spent the next 4 hours not angry, but deeply, calculatingly focused, utilizing my expertise in data visualization to build a presentation deck so mathematically devastating, so completely devoid of emotion and heavy with undeniable, verified statistics, that it would leave her with absolutely nowhere to hide. The community clubhouse smelled overwhelmingly of damp carpet, cheap cleaning chemicals, and suburban dread, packed with about 20 uneasy neighbors shifting in unforgiving metal folding chairs, as Evelyn sat at the head of a folding table like a presiding judge at a witch trial, slamming a literal wooden gavel and launching into a breathy, wildly exaggerated monologue about the imminent, apocalyptic danger my home posed, officially proposing a staggering $10,000 punitive fine and a forced eviction of my equipment. When it was my turn, I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I simply dimmed the lights, fired up a portable, high-lumen projector, and painted the back wall with a massive, beautifully rendered line graph showing certified decibel readings proving my servers were quieter than a public library, followed by a scanned, personalized letter from the regional director of ComEd Illinois explicitly confirming that my self-funded, dedicated power line had zero impact on the neighborhood transformer and concluding with a predictive energy model showing that my new geothermal loop would actually reduce the neighborhood's overall carbon footprint, effectively making their grid more stable. The silence in that room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute, the air thick with the realization that Evelyn had manufactured a crisis out of pure, vindictive ego, and as the timid board members began to mumble their apologies and hastily dismiss the charges, Evelyn's face morphed into a terrifying, mottled mask of crimson rage, her eyes locking onto mine with a hatred so deep it felt almost physical, whispering that this wasn't over before storming out into the humid night air. The final, breaking point of her sanity snapped the very next morning, heralded by the screeching tires of a Naperville police cruiser ripping up my driveway, driven by Officer Dempsey, a veteran cop who looked like he hadn't slept since the late 90s, and Officer Reed, a rookie clutching a notebook, summoned by a hysterical, screaming 911 call from Evelyn claiming that I was running a cyber-terrorist command center capable of shutting down the state's infrastructure. I didn't panic. I just smiled, invited the heavily armed officers into the garage, and watched their jaws physically drop as they stepped into the breathtaking, neon-lit vastness of my server farm, walking them through the meticulously bound binders of city approvals, showing them the official commendation letter from the mayor's office thanking me for preventing a catastrophic gridlock during the winter festival, and explaining exactly how my system functioned as a redundant, pro bono safety net for their own city. Officer Dempsey closed the binder with a heavy sigh of absolute exhaustion, walking back out into the blinding sunlight, staring down a vibrating, expectant Evelyn, and delivering a verbal dressing down so severe, warning her that if she ever weaponized police resources for her petty HOA vendettas again, she would be leaving in handcuffs, that it visibly shattered the last remaining fragments of her grip on reality. Later that evening, as the sky bruised a deep, threatening purple and a violent Midwestern storm began to roll in, she marched across her manicured lawn, stopping exactly at the property line, her face twitching, her voice dropping to a terrifying, dead calm whisper that barely carried over the rising wind, bypassing all the rules, all the bylaws, and all the pretense, looking me dead in the eye and promising, with chilling, unhinged certainty, that she was going to physically sever my power. and plunge my digital empire into the dark, forcing me to warn her, with a voice just as cold, that touching that line was a federal felony that would ruin her life. A warning she absorbed with a blank, predatory stare before turning away, leaving me to realize that I wasn't dealing with a nuisance anymore. I was dealing with a fanatic who had nothing left to lose. The storm that hit Naperville that night wasn't just a passing shower. It was a furious, howling deluge of horizontal rain and deafening thunder, a violent atmospheric backdrop that perfectly mirrored the escalating, localized warfare threatening to tear our street apart. And I sat in the command chair of my garage, bathed in the soft, reliable glow of my monitors, watching the city traffic flow flawlessly through the tempest, feeling a deep, instinctual sense of dread settling heavy in my gut. I had spent my entire career engineering contingencies, building redundancies upon redundancies to protect against failures in logic, software crashes, and natural disasters. But the ultimate flaw in any system is always the human element, the unpredictable, irrational chaos of a bitter, broken person. And at precisely 11:37 p.m., my perimeter motion tracking software flashed a brilliant, pulsing red warning on the fourth monitor, ripping me out of my thoughts. I zoomed the high-definition, night vision feed onto the narrow, rain-slicked corridor between our houses, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead as I watched a dark, hooded figure, Evelyn, wrapped in a heavy trench coat, slinking through the driving rain, clutching a massive, heavy-duty pair of industrial bolt cutters that glinted menacingly in the flashes of lightning. The sheer, unadulterated insanity of the moment paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. The unbelievable reality that a middle-aged neighborhood association president was actually committing a high-level federal crime over a bruised ego and a dispute about landscaping. Watching in slow, agonizing motion as she approached the heavy-gauge, armored ComEd junction box on the side of my house, bracing her boots in the mud, wrapping her hands around the long handles of the cutters, and squeezing, with every ounce of spite in her body. A blinding, violent shower of blue-white sparks exploded in the darkness, illuminating her terrified, demonic face for a split second before the massive cable severed, and instantly, my entire world, the humming servers, the glowing monitors, the quiet symphony of my cooling fans, the invisible tether keeping the city intersections alive, was violently ripped into a deafening, pitch-black silence, leaving only the eerie, blood-red emergency glow of my uninterruptible power supplies kicking in, accompanied by the shrill, panic-inducing shriek of the critical failure klaxons. But Evelyn had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She thought she was cutting off a civilian, unaware that she had just triggered a deeply buried, custom-coded doomsday sequence I had named Protocol Tartarus. And instead of waiting for the city grid to heal, I slammed my hand down on the manual override switch on my console, feeling the concrete floor beneath my feet begin to vibrate with a deep, prehistoric rumble as my massive, custom-built, soundproof diesel generator roared to life out in the backyard, pumping an ocean of stable, unstoppable electricity back into my veins. The garage exploded back into brilliant, humming life, my monitors snapping on, the traffic grid reconnecting and stabilizing in milliseconds. But Protocol Tartarus wasn't just designed to save me. It was designed to judge. Utilizing a backdoor exploit I had written into the neighborhood's smart meters to selectively distribute my localized power grid based on a hyper-specific algorithm I had built to measure neighborhood loyalty. I watched the progress bar tear across the screen, routing pristine, golden power to Julian's house, illuminating the darkness as a reward for his tech solidarity, then bleeding power to the neighbors who had stood up to her tyranny, skipping over her loyalists, and finally, executing the ultimate, devastating payload of malicious compliance aimed directly and exclusively at Evelyn's address. I didn't leave her in the dark. That would have been far too merciful. I fed her exactly enough voltage to boot up her hyper-expensive, integrated smart home ecosystem, watching through the split-screen security feeds as her own house turned against her, her internet-connected refrigerator suddenly blasting high volume, distorted carnival music on a permanent, unmutable loop, her $1,000 smart bulbs strobing violently in an inescapable SOS pattern, and her massive living room television locking onto a permanent, high-resolution image of the very legal, permits she had tried to destroy. She stumbled back inside, drenched and shivering, expecting the quiet satisfaction of a successful sabotage, only to be hit by a wall of chaotic noise and flashing lights, screaming in pure, frantic terror as she tried to unplug appliances that were running on hidden battery backups, racing to the garage to flee in her pristine Prius, only to find that my protocol had permanently locked the electronic bay doors shut, effectively trapping her in a flashing, screaming, digital purgatory of her own making, while her exterior smart sprinklers activated in the pouring rain, aggressively blasting her prize-winning flower beds into a muddy pulp. She finally broke, abandoning her house and sprinting into the storm, pounding on doors until the neighbors called the police, and 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of Officer Dempsey's cruiser washed over my driveway once again, finding me standing casually in my open, fully powered garage, sipping a hot cup of coffee, holding a freshly printed incident report binder containing the crystal-clear, high-definition video of her severing the main power line. Officer Dempsey didn't even say a word. He just looked at the video, looked at the severed cable throwing sparks in the mud, looked at the blinding, strobing nightmare of Evelyn's house, and calmly walked over to where she was standing in the rain, screaming about satellites and hackers, grabbing her by the arm, spinning her around, and clamping cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, arresting her for felony destruction of public utility infrastructure as she shot me one final, broken look of absolute defeat. In the aftermath, the neighborhood breathed a collective, massive sigh of relief. The tyrannical bylaws were burned in a celebratory bonfire. Julian took over the association, bringing peace and leniency to the streets, and Evelyn, facing massive civil suits from the power company and real jail time, was forced to sell her house in disgrace, disappearing from our lives forever. I stood in my garage weeks later, listening to the beautiful, uninterrupted hum of my servers, writing a tiny, permanent string of code into the city traffic grid that would cross-reference her specific license plate, ensuring that no matter where she drove in this city, she would always hit a red light, a small, invisible tax on her existence, leaving me to stare at the glowing screens, surrounded by my family of silicon and wire, wondering, as the silence settled over my perfectly optimized world, when someone pushes you to the absolute edge, trying to destroy the only piece you have left in this world, and you possess the ungodly power to absolutely ruin them without ever throwing a single punch. Does using that power make you a monster, or does it simply make you the inevitable, balancing force of justice?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.